The message arrived without warning, as all pivotal things do. It came not through radio frequencies or laser pulse communications, the methods humanity had been listening for across 7 decades of deep space monitoring. It arrived as a direct electromagnetic intrusion into every major satellite relay system simultaneously, translated in real time into 43 of Earth's most widely spoken languages. The translation itself was unsettling. Whoever, whatever, had sent it had been observing humanity long enough to understand not just syntax but idiom, cultural weight, the specific gravity of certain words. The message was 41 seconds long. It has since been listened to, studied, and debated more than any transmission in recorded history. Condensed to its core, it said this: "You are inhabitants of a contested developmental zone designated Sector 7 Rho under the Compact Accords of the Galactic Compact. Your world falls within the sovereign expansion corridor of the hegemony of Kethvara. You will acknowledge this designation. You will cease all extra-atmospheric activity. You will submit an official declaration of planetary subordination within 72 of your planetary hours. Failure to comply will be interpreted as hostile intent. The compact does not negotiate with pre-expansion civilizations." It ended there. No salutation. No offer of dialogue. No introduction. The United Earth Security Council convened within 6 minutes of confirmed receipt. The session was classified at the highest level, but transcripts were leaked within 3 days. Not by saboteurs but by staffers who believed, correctly, that the public had a right to know the shape of the decision being made on their behalf. What the transcripts reveal is not panic. That is what surprises historians most looking back. There was anger, certainly. There was disbelief. Several delegates spent the first hour arguing that the message was a hoax, a coordinated cyber operation by a rival state actor. That argument collapsed when the Lunar Relay Array confirmed the signal's point of origin. A source approximately 0.3 light-years beyond the heliopause, moving at a velocity consistent with a decelerating fleet. A fleet. Not a single vessel. Spectral analysis conducted by 3 independent deep space observatories in the hours following the message's arrival estimated the fleet at somewhere between 40 and 90 distinct objects, each radiating thermal signatures far beyond anything in humanity's propulsion catalog. The smallest registered objects were approximately the mass of a destroyer-class warship. The largest were something else entirely: gravitationally significant, slow-moving, immense. Dr. Yael Ostrov, then director of the Sol System Defense Coordination Office, later wrote in her memoir that standing in the darkened operations center and watching those thermal blooms resolve on the long-range array was the most clarifying moment of her life. Not frightening. Clarifying. Because suddenly every argument about defense budgets, every political compromise, every decade of slow institutional resistance to building humanity's outer system deterrent capacity, all of it crystallized into a single irreducible fact. They had come. And they had come expecting nothing. That assumption, that Earth would be silent, compliant, stunned into submission, is the thread that runs through everything that followed. The Kethvara hegemony was, by all subsequent intelligence assessments, a sophisticated and genuinely powerful interstellar civilization. Their fleet was real. Their technology was formidable. Their political structure, a tiered dominion system built on centuries of absorbing smaller civilizations, was stable and well documented in the data packets that accompanied the ultimatum, presumably included as evidence of the compact's legitimacy. They were not bluffing. But they had made a calculation error. A profound one. The kind that stems not from lack of intelligence, but from a lack of relevant reference points. They had watched humanity. They had catalogued our wars, our resource conflicts, our political fractures. They had seen a species that had spent centuries fighting itself and concluded, reasonably by their own metrics, that a species so divided could not possibly mount a coherent response to an external threat within 72 hours. They expected the kind of paralysis that comes from distributed power structures, competing national interests, and no unified military command with the authority to act. What they did not know, what they could not have known from observation alone, was that humanity had spent the last 31 years quietly building exactly that authority, and exactly that capacity, precisely because we always suspected this moment was coming. Not because we were certain, but because we thought it was better to be wrong and prepared than right and helpless. The Security Council's first formal resolution, passed at hour 4 of the 72-hour window, was classified under emergency wartime protocols. It authorized the Secretary-General to activate Standing Order 12, a contingency document drafted in 2041 and updated 3 times since, never before invoked. Standing Order 12 transferred operational command of all extra-atmospheric military assets to a single command structure, the Unified Seoul Defense Directorate. The Directorate's first act was to transmit a short, carefully worded response to the source coordinates of the alien fleet. The response said, "We have received your message. We are deliberating. Please stand by." Simple. Measured. Buying time. Because in the outer system something was already moving. Something that had been moving quietly for the past 19 hours, beginning the moment the first preliminary signals of the alien fleet's deceleration had been detected by the heliopause monitoring buoys. The Black Armada was being recalled. Not mobilized. Recalled. Because it had never stood down. The term Black Armada did not originate in any official document. It appeared first in an internal communication between two engineers at the Europa Deep Fabrication Complex in 2047, used casually to describe the color-absorbing thermal baffling applied to the new generation of outer system patrol vessels. The material, a carbon lattice composite developed originally for asteroid mining equipment, reduced the vessel's infrared signature by approximately 94% at operational distances. In the vacuum of the outer solar system, where background radiation was thin and detection ranges were long, this was not a cosmetic choice. It was a doctrine. The engineer's informal label stuck, as informal labels tend to. By 2051 it was being used in classified briefings. By 2057, when the first full battle group completed its operational trials beyond the orbit of Neptune, even the Admiralty was using it. The Armada, by the time the Kethvara ultimatum arrived, comprised 47 warships organized into 6 operational groups. The public knew vaguely that humanity had defense assets in the outer system. What the public did not know, what was deliberately withheld not out of deception but out of strategic necessity, was the scale, the readiness, or the doctrine those assets embodied. To understand what that doctrine was, you have to understand the thinking that produced it. In the mid-2030s, following the first confirmed detection of what astronomers cautiously termed structured electromagnetic signatures from 3 separate star systems within 40 light-years of Seoul, the United Earth Security Council commissioned a classified study. The study, known internally as the Cassandra Assessment, asked a single question. If a technologically superior alien civilization chose to approach Earth with hostile or coercive intent, what would be the most dangerous assumption we could make? The answer the assessment team reached was not that they would attack without warning. It was not that they would be too powerful to resist. The most dangerous assumption, the assessment concluded, was that they would approach Earth. Because if a hostile fleet reached Earth orbit, the engagement would be decided in humanity's home system, with Earth itself as both the strategic objective and the hostage. Every weapon fired in defense of the planet would risk the planet. Every asset committed to Earth's defense was an asset that could not maneuver, could not choose its ground, could not dictate the terms of engagement. The solution the Cassandra Assessment proposed was conceptually simple and operationally enormous. Don't let them reach Earth. Build a defense layer at the frontier. Build it far enough out that any engagement occurs in deep space, where there is nothing to hold hostage and nothing to lose except ships. Build it with enough depth that even a partial defeat doesn't open a corridor to the inner system. Build it quietly with low observable technology, so that any approaching force does not know what they are sailing into until the moment it matters. This was not aggression. The doctrine was explicitly and carefully non-first strike. The Armada's rules of engagement, updated and re-ratified every 3 years by the Security Council, were clear. No offensive action without confirmed hostile act. The fleet existed not to threaten but to absorb, resist, and if necessary, attrit. The terminology used in planning documents was deterrence through uncertainty. If a potential adversary could not know what they were facing, they could not accurately assess the cost of coercion. And if the cost was uncertain, rational actors would prefer negotiation. The Kethvara hegemony, it turned out, was not primarily composed of rational actors. Or rather, their rationality was built on a foundation of experience that had never included a target that could actually hit back. Admiral Chen Wei, commanding officer of the Black Armada and a woman who had spent 19 years in the outer system on successive tours of duty that the general public had no knowledge of, received the activation order at 0347 hours Seoul Standard Time. She was already awake. Her operations staff had been tracking the incoming fleet's deceleration curve for 11 hours. Battle group disposition, she said to her operations officer without preamble, relative to the fleet's projected intercept corridor? Lieutenant Commander Dara Mensa pulled up the plot. 6 color-coded clusters of ship icons, spread across a volume of space roughly 600 million kilometers in diameter, arranged in overlapping fields of fire and sensor coverage. Not a wall. Not a line. A web. Groups 1, 3, and 5 are optimally positioned, Mensa reported. 2 and 4 need approximately 9 hours of drift correction to reach preferred firing solutions. 6 is already inside their projected sensor range, passive only, no emissions. Leave 6 cold, Chen said. I want them to see what I decide to show them, nothing else. She studied the plot for a moment. And their projected deceleration timeline? At current burn profile, they'll reach the threshold marker in approximately 58 hours. Chen nodded slowly. The threshold marker was an imaginary line 4.2 astronomical units from the Sun, roughly the inner edge of the asteroid belt. It had no legal significance. It had no formal status in any treaty. It was simply the point at which the Armada's doctrine shifted from observation to active deterrence posture. 58 hours, she repeated. We have time. What are your orders, Admiral? She was quiet for a moment. We do nothing dramatic. We maintain current posture. We keep groups 2 and 4 on their correction burns, but at minimum emission. I don't want active drives unless necessary. And I want a full intelligence compilation on whatever we have in the database on the Kethvara hegemony from those data packets they sent. Already compiling, Admiral. Good. She stood, rolling her shoulders slightly, a habit from decades in low-gravity environments. One more thing. Give me a line to Earth Command. I want to speak with the Security Council before they make any more decisions about how to talk to these people. What she told the Security Council in a 40-minute secure call conducted while her flagship drifted silently at the edge of the outer asteroid belt, was this. Don't show fear, don't show aggression, and above all, don't tell them what's out here. They sent an ultimatum, she said, her voice even and precise. That means they're used to ultimatums working. The moment they understand why this one won't, everything changes. Let them keep their assumptions as long as possible. The Security Council voted 7-2 to follow her recommendation. The Kethvara fleet continued its deceleration. 57 hours remained. And in the cold dark between Jupiter and Saturn, 47 ships that didn't officially exist held their positions and waited. At hour 61, 13 hours past the original 72-hour deadline, the Kethvara fleet crossed the threshold marker. They had received Earth's second communication 14 hours earlier. It was a single paragraph, transmitted in the same frequency band the hegemony had used for their ultimatum, translated into the language of the Compact's original message. The United Earth Government acknowledges receipt of the Compact's communication. We are engaged in the internal deliberative process required by our governing structure before any formal response can be issued. We respectfully request an extension of the stated timeline to allow this process to conclude with appropriate legitimacy. We wish to communicate in good faith. Precise. Deferential in tone without being submissive in content. The phrase appropriate legitimacy was chosen deliberately. It implied process without implying weakness, and it was accurate. The Security Council was genuinely deliberating. The hegemony's response, received 6 hours later, was 3 words. The deadline stands. They had not extended the window. But they also had not fired. That was noted. They crossed the threshold at reduced velocity, not the deep deceleration of a landing approach, but the measured slowdown of a formation that was positioning, not arriving. Their vector was inner system broadly. Toward the Sun. Toward Earth. Admiral Chen watched the fleet's new positional data populate the holographic plot and felt the peculiar calm that comes from the closing of options. This was no longer a contingency. This was an event. Battle group status, she said. Mensa read it without looking up from his console. All 6 groups in position. Groups 1, 3, and 5 confirm optimal firing solutions. 2 and 4 are corrected and nominal. 6 reports passive sensor lock on lead elements of the hostile formation. They're close enough to count hull plates. Group 6 is not to maneuver, Chen said. Not yet. The hostile fleet, she had stopped thinking of them as anything but hostile after they crossed the threshold, was organized in a configuration her intelligence staff had labeled Imperial Transit Formation. A cluster of larger vessels in the center, surrounded by a screen of faster, smaller ships in a roughly spherical arrangement. Classic escort doctrine. The large central vessels were the command ships, the heavy weapons platforms, the logistical cores. The screen was the sword. It was, her analysts noted, an extremely effective formation for approaching a target that had no outer system defenses. They haven't changed their sensor posture, said Commander Reyes from the intelligence station. still using active long-range sweeps. They're not being careful about concealment, they're announcing themselves. Because they don't think they need to be careful, Chin replied. What are they seeing? Reyes pulled up the sensor profile. Based on our current emission posture, they're seeing approximately nothing. Some residual thermal scatter from Group 2's correction burns, but at this range, that's indistinguishable from solar wind particle interactions. They might not even have registered it. Chin allowed herself a quiet exhale. Then they still think they're sailing into an empty system. Appears so, Admiral. She thought about that for a moment. 47 ships, 83,000 personnel, 19 years of doctrine and training and preparation. And right now, to the most powerful alien fleet humanity had ever encountered, they were invisible. Not because they were hidden in some fanciful way. Because humanity had spent 2 decades learning exactly how to be quiet in space, and the hegemony had never imagined they would need to. It was not a moment for satisfaction. It was a moment for decision. Chin issued her orders precisely. Group 6 will hold position and maintain passive lock. I want real-time telemetry on those lead elements, their drive signatures, their weapon system emissions, anything their active sweeps illuminate. Groups 1, 3 and 5 will shift to pre-engagement posture. Weapons warm but not hot, drives to standby. 2 and 4 remain in position, dark. If the formation splits or accelerates, 2 and 4 engage the flanks. Not before. She paused. And open a direct channel to the hegemony fleet. I'll transmit personally. The communications officer looked up. Admiral, that will reveal our position. 1 ship's position, Chin corrected. On my mark. She stood at the communications console, adjusted the camera framing out of habit, a reflex from years of command briefings, and waited for the green light. Then she spoke in the compact's own language, which her translation system rendered in real time. This is Admiral Chin Wei, Commanding Officer of the Sol System Defense Force, Unified Sol Defense Directorate, United Earth Government. Your formation has entered sovereign Sol System space without authorization, following an ultimatum that was not agreed to by any legitimate governing body of the Sol System's inhabitants. I am formally notifying you that you are in contested space and that we have assets in this system capable of responding to hostile action. I am also formally requesting that your formation cease its advance and that we establish a communications channel for negotiated resolution. We prefer dialogue. We are prepared for the alternative. She cut the transmission. Reyes looked at her. That was either very brave or very calculated. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Chin said. She was watching the plot, the hegemony fleet's response signatures, looking for changes in drive power, formation shift, weapon system activation. How long for our signal to reach them and a response to return? At current separation, call it 22 minutes round trip. Then we wait 22 minutes. The response when it came was not from the fleet. It was from a different transmission source, farther back outside the system entirely. The command authority. The hegemony itself, speaking from beyond the heliopause. It was longer than the original ultimatum. More careful. Which was itself information. It said, translated into English by Chen's communications team. Asterisk, you have military assets in your outer system. This was not anticipated. State their number and class. The hegemony will assess and respond accordingly. Asterisk. Chin read the translation twice. They were asking. Not demanding. Asking. She thought about what that meant. An organization built on centuries of unopposed expansion, now, for perhaps the first time, encountering something it hadn't modeled. And its first instinct, rather than escalation, was information gathering. She wrote her response herself, without consultation. We decline to provide an order of battle to a force that has entered our system without permission. If the hegemony genuinely wishes to negotiate, we suggest withdrawing your fleet to beyond the heliopause and establishing a diplomatic channel through the compact's own protocols. If you wish to continue your advance, you will learn what you are facing through direct experience. The choice is yours. We will wait. She sent it and turned back to the plot. They'll think about that, she said quietly. And if they don't? Mensa asked. Then Group 1 engages the forward screen at maximum effective range, Chin said, her voice carrying no particular weight. And we find out how good we really are. The hegemony fleet did not withdraw. It did stop. For 9 hours and 40 minutes, the formation held position at roughly 3.8 astronomical units. Inside the threshold, outside effective weapons range for most of the Armada systems, and presumably outside effective weapons range for most of theirs as well. A standoff of sorts. During those 9 hours, the Armada's intelligence teams worked without rest. The passive sensors on Group 6, pressed close enough to the hegemony formation to read individual drive signatures, fed a constant stream of data back through low probability of intercept relay links. Chen's analysts built a picture, piece by piece, of what humanity was actually facing. The final intelligence estimate, delivered to Chen at the 6-hour mark of the standoff, was not optimistic in the conventional sense. But it was precise, and precision was what she needed. The hegemony fleet consisted of 73 vessels. Larger than the initial estimate. The central formation held what appeared to be 8 capital ships, vessels in the mass range of 800,000 to 1.2 million metric tons, with drive signatures consistent with multi-stage antimatter-catalyzed fusion propulsion. The outer screen was 65 vessels, ranging from fast attack craft in the 8,000-ton range to midweight combatants around 120,000 tons. Weapons assessment was necessarily speculative, but based on emission profiles and the data packets the hegemony had sent with their original ultimatum, which included, somewhat ironically, technical specifications of their fleet's capabilities apparently intended to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Chen's analysts estimated the fleet carried directed energy weapons in the gigawatt to terawatt range, kinetic delivery systems, and what appeared to be some form of area denial munition, with a large dispersal radius. Against this, the Armada had 47 vessels, smaller on average than the hegemony's capital ships, but designed specifically for one environment, this environment. The outer solar system. Long-range, high-accuracy kinetic weapons. Electromagnetic rail systems. Coordinated fire control networks linking all 6 groups into a single targeting architecture. And, critically, the positional advantage of a force that had chosen its ground. The force ratio was not favorable. Anyone who tells you differently is not being honest with you. But force ratios are not the only variable in combat. Initiative. Surprise. Geometry. The ability to dictate the terms of engagement, to choose when and where and how the first exchange occurs. These things have weight. Chen's doctrine, developed over 19 years, was built around a concept her planning staff called depth and complexity. Don't try to match the enemy at the point of their choosing. Force them to face threats from multiple vectors simultaneously. Make the geometry of engagement work against their formation's design, which was optimized for a threat from one direction, the direction of the target. At the 9-hour mark, the hegemony fleet resumed its advance. Chen was ready. Group 1, she said, her voice steady on the fleet network. Weapons free. Primary targets, forward screen, outer edge. Standard salvo pattern, full spread. I want to see their formation response before we commit the second strike package. At a range of approximately 180,000 kilometers, well within the Armada's kinetic envelope, which the hegemony's planners had apparently not fully credited, Group 1's 12 ships fired. The volley was not dramatic to observe, in the way that science fiction combat tends to be dramatized. No visible beams. No explosions visible from a distance. What the Armada's weapons delivered were tungsten composite penetrators, accelerated to approximately 0.008% of light speed by electromagnetic rail systems, crossing 180,000 kilometers in just under 7 seconds per round. Individually, each penetrator carried kinetic energy comparable to a small conventional warhead. In the coordinated salvo pattern Group 1 deployed, the combined impact was something else. The hegemony's outer screen lost 6 vessels in the first 8 seconds. 4 more took damage severe enough that their drive signatures degraded visibly on the passive sensors. The formation did what formations do when they take unexpected fire from an unexpected direction. It reacted. The outer screen contracted inward, seeking shelter near the capital ships. The capital ships increased drive power, either to maneuver or to run. The data wasn't conclusive in the moment. 2 of the heavier combatants turned and began firing, directed energy weapons. The sensors confirmed gigawatt-class coherent light, but they were firing at where Group 1 ships had been, not where they were. Because Group 1 had already begun the lateral drift Chen had planned for. Not a retreat. A repositioning. Groups 3 and 5, Chen said. Engage on my mark. Flanking vectors, capital ship formation. Focus fire on drive sections. I want mobility kills before we attempt kills. She paused half a second, reading the formation data. Mark. The engagement that followed lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, with periods of intense exchange separated by lulls as both sides maneuvered and reassessed. The Armada took damage, real, significant damage. 3 ships in Group 3 were struck by directed energy weapons powerful enough to penetrate their thermal baffling and burn into hull structure. 1. The USDF Perseverance lost drive power entirely and had to be covered by the other two ships in her element. 11 personnel were killed in the engagement across multiple vessels, and the casualty list was worse than that when you counted wounded. The hegemony fleet did not break in a single moment. That is important to understand. These were not creatures who panicked easily. They were, by their own historical record, experienced military actors who had won every engagement they had ever fought. But they had never fought in a volume of space where the enemy knew every fold of the terrain and they did not. They had never fought against a coordinated multi-vector fire control system that could link 47 ships into a single targeting solution. They had never fought an adversary who was willing to take damage, real damage, costly damage, without flinching. At the 3-hour mark, Group 6 finally moved. The 12 ships that had been running cold and dark, pressed against the hegemony's flank, activated their drives and weapons simultaneously. A burst of fire against the capital ship formation's exposed port quarter that destroyed 2 of the heavy combatants and critically damaged a third before the hegemony command ships could rotate their screens to cover. That was the moment. Not a rout. Not a collapse. A decision made by whoever commanded the hegemony fleet, that the cost of continuing was unacceptable. The formation began a coordinated withdrawal. Not flight, the word is important, but a deliberate, disciplined pullback toward the outer system. They maintained formation integrity. They covered their damaged vessels. They fought rearguard actions against Groups 1 and 3 as they withdrew. Chen watched them go and did not pursue beyond the threshold marker. All groups, she said on the fleet network, maintain position. No pursuit past the marker. Damage assessment and recovery operations take priority. She stared at the plot for a long moment. 73 ships had entered humanity's solar system expecting nothing. 47 ships had been waiting. 17 of the 73 were not leaving. The hegemony fleet crossed back through the heliopause 11 days after the engagement ended. They crossed in silence, no transmissions, no further ultimatums. Their formation was different from the one that had entered. Tighter, more cautious, the remaining vessels grouped around the capital ships in a protective cluster that was more instinct than doctrine. The confident transit formation of an expansionist power was gone. What replaced it was something more careful, and something that the analysts watching the plot found more instructive than any explicit communication. What they reported back to the Hegemony Command Authority has never been fully disclosed to the public. The complete transmission logs were among the intelligence materials recovered in the years following the first contact incident through back-channel diplomatic sources, and much of the content remains classified. But enough has been released, and enough has been reconstructed by independent intelligence researchers, to understand the broad strokes of what the hegemony told its leadership about what it had found at Seoul. The official report described the engagement as a prepared ambush by a technologically developed pre-compact civilization operating military assets significantly beyond the developmental stage indicated by surface monitoring. In hegemony political language, pre-compact meant a civilization that had not yet been absorbed into the compact structure, implying that the hegemony had, in effect, attacked a civilization it had categorized as unready for contact, and had been soundly challenged. This was politically significant within the hegemony's internal structure. The compact's laws, the body of interstellar agreements the hegemony operated under and frequently exploited, contained provisions regarding what were termed emergent civilizations. Civilizations below a certain technological threshold were categorized as compact protectorates, meaning that attacking them was legally actionable within the compact's judicial framework. Civilizations above the threshold were classified as contested parties, meaning that engaging them without formal declaration was considered aggression, not expansion. The hegemony's classification of Earth as a pre-compact emergent civilization had provided the legal cover for the ultimatum. The engagement had destroyed that cover. Whatever Earth was, it was not a civilization below the threshold. The internal political fallout within the hegemony, pieced together years later from diplomatic sources, was substantial. Several senior military officials were sanctioned. The fleet commander, a figure the compact records identified as Sub-Executor Vethkaran, was recalled and faced a formal inquiry. The legal status of the hegemony Sol system claim was challenged by 3 other compact member civilizations, who cited the engagement as evidence that the hegemony had violated compact expansion protocols. On Earth, the aftermath was its own kind of complex. The public learned the full truth in stages, not because governments were deliberately concealing it, but because the truth was vast and the institutions needed to absorb it weren't built yet. The existence of the Black Armada was disclosed in a formal address by the Secretary-General 48 hours after the engagement ended. The reaction was not, primarily, anger at having been kept in the dark. The reaction for most of it was something harder to categorize. A species that had spent centuries telling itself stories about first contact, benevolent alien teachers, catastrophic alien invaders, the whole vast imaginative literature of science fiction, was discovering that the reality fit neither template precisely. The Kethvara hegemony was not a monster. It was a bureaucracy with a military arm, operating within a legal framework, making a calculated risk that had not paid off. The engagement had not saved Earth from annihilation. It had contested an illegal territorial claim in the most direct way available, at significant cost, and the outcome was unresolved. The engagement wasn't a victory in the triumphalist sense. The word that Dr. Ostroff used in her memoir was statement. Humanity had made a statement, in the only language that has ever worked when legal frameworks and diplomatic channels aren't yet established, the language of demonstrated capability. Admiral Chin, in her formal after-action report filed 6 weeks after the engagement, was characteristically precise in her assessment. "We did not defeat the hegemony," she wrote. "We demonstrated to the hegemony that the cost of attempting to coerce Earth would consistently exceed any strategic benefit they could project from the exercise. This is the correct definition of deterrence. The engagement achieved deterrence. Whether it achieves long-term security depends entirely on what diplomatic structures we build from here, and whether we build them before another party decides to test the calculus again. The Armada itself, its existence now public, its operations now a matter of ongoing political debate, continued its patrols. The force was restructured over the following years, expanded with increased funding and public mandate, and eventually formalized as the sole defense force under a treaty framework ratified by 81 of Earth's national governments. It was, in retrospect, the strangest thing. The engagement had not made humanity feel invulnerable. The 11 dead, the wounded, the damaged ships, those numbers were real and they were felt, publicly and privately, in the way that real costs always are. If anything, the engagement had made humanity feel something more useful than invulnerability. It had made humanity feel serious. Not the seriousness of a civilization that had decided to be militaristic. The seriousness of a civilization that had looked honestly at the size of the universe it existed in, calculated the range of things the universe might contain, and made an adult decision about what kind of presence it intended to be. The Compact's response to the engagement took 8 months to arrive in formal diplomatic form. It was, in effect, an invitation. Not to subordination. Not to the kind of join or be absorbed framework the hegemony had assumed would apply. The Compact, embarrassed by its own institutional standards, by the hegemony's actions, extended to the United Earth government a formal inquiry as to whether Earth wished to be considered for Compact membership under the standard protocols applicable to civilizations that had demonstrated independent development above the tactical threshold. The Security Council debated for 3 months. They ultimately sent back a response that was cautious, measured, and strategically sound. Earth was willing to discuss the parameters of a relationship with the Compact, beginning with a formal diplomatic mission and including a comprehensive review of the Compact's legal framework as it applied to sovereign system rights. Not yes. Not no. We're listening, but we're not naive. Humanity, it turned out, was quite good at that particular diplomatic register. The Compact had not experienced an event like it in 600 years. That was the figure that kept appearing in the intelligence assessments. 600 years since a civilization below a certain developmental threshold had successfully contested a hegemony territorial claim by force of arms. 600 years since the institutional calculus that governed expansion politics had been genuinely disrupted rather than merely bent. The previous case, according to Compact historical records eventually translated and released to the public, had involved a species called the Vorith, a civilization of aquatic, roughly cephalopod-equivalent beings who had developed directed energy weapons approximately 2 centuries ahead of their propulsion technology, due to the specific requirements of warfare in their dense oceanic environment. The hegemony of that era had sent a colonization fleet and lost most of it to weapons mounted on orbital platforms the Vorith had been building quietly for 40 years. The Vorith were now one of the Compact's founding permanent members. The parallel was not lost on analysts. But the Sol incident was different in ways that mattered. The Vorith had fought purely defensively in their own system from fixed positions. Humanity had deployed a distributed mobile force. The Vorith had been discovered. Earth had been watched and categorized for decades before the ultimatum. And critically, the Vorith's defensive capability had been apparent from external observation. The Black Armada had not been. That last point is what the Compact's military and intelligence institutions found genuinely unsettling. A civilization can build impressive fixed defenses and the fact is visible. You can see the orbital platforms. You can estimate their power output. You can decide whether the cost of engaging them is worth the strategic return. The calculation is difficult, but it is calculable. What the Seoul engagement revealed was a civilization that had developed the doctrine, the materials science, the operational security, and the institutional will to build a large, mobile, low-observable military force in deep space, over a period of decades, without that force appearing in any external survey data. The thermal baffling that gave the Armada its name was not uniquely sophisticated by Compact standards. What was sophisticated was the commitment to applying it consistently, maintaining operational emissions discipline across an entire fleet for years on end, and integrating it into a tactical doctrine that made the force genuinely difficult to assess at engagement range. In the Compact's strategic assessment literature, documents that Earth intelligence had partial access to through diplomatic sources within 2 years of the engagement, the Seoul incident was categorized under a classification that translates roughly as uncharted developmental trajectory. Meaning, this species developed along lines that our models did not predict, and we do not yet have a framework for projecting their future development. That classification carried weight. Civilizations in that category were, within the Compact's protocols, extended certain precautionary diplomatic courtesies that would not ordinarily apply to a civilization of Earth's developmental age. 3 Compact member civilizations reached out directly to the United Earth government within 18 months of the engagement, not through the Compact's formal diplomatic apparatus, but through quiet, back-channel contact initiated via the same frequency ranges the hegemony had used for their original ultimatum. The messages were, in their own way, extraordinary. The first, from a civilization the Compact records identified as the Tesseract Collective, a distributed, multi-system confederation that had been absorbed into the Compact 4 centuries earlier, was almost apologetic in tone. It expressed sympathy for Earth's situation, noted that the collective had faced a comparable moment of contested first contact in its own history, and offered to share what diplomatic records it retained from that period. No conditions. No requests. Simply an offer. The second was more direct. It came from the Compact member known as the Rath-Salani, an older civilization that occupied a position of significant influence within the Compact's legislative structures. The message expressed what translated as cautious respect, noted that the Rath-Salani had been among the Compact members who formally challenged the hegemony's classification of Earth in the legal proceedings following the engagement, and stated plainly that the Rath-Salani considered Earth's independent development to be of significant interest to the Compact's long-term stability. The third message was harder to categorize. It came from a source that identified itself only as the observers, which the translation team initially flagged as possibly a poetic or metaphorical term, and consisted almost entirely of questions. Precise, carefully constructed questions about human history, about the decision-making process that had led to the Armada's development, about the internal political structures that had allowed a multi-decade classified military program to survive across multiple government transitions. Not hostile questions. Curious ones. Earth's intelligence community spent considerable time trying to identify the observers. They never conclusively did. The working hypothesis, still classified, is that the observers are not a single civilization but a body of some kind, a monitoring organization possibly older than the Compact itself, and that their interest in Earth represents something other than strategic calculation. On Earth itself, the year following the engagement was a period of disorienting normalcy. Life continued. People went to work, had children, argued about politics. The alien fleet was gone. The diplomatic correspondence was classified. The physical reality of an interstellar community of civilizations had been confirmed beyond any doubt, but it hadn't descended into anyone's daily experience yet. What had changed was subtler. It was there in the way the news covered scientific discoveries, with a new awareness of audience. It was there in the spike in enrollment at universities offering astrobiology, xenolinguistics, and, significantly, international law programs with Compact protocol specialization tracks. It was there in the polling data showing a consistent, durable increase in public support for space-based defense funding that cut across political lines in ways that very few policy areas ever achieve. Something had shifted in humanity's sense of itself. Not toward arrogance. The 11 dead and the treaty debates and the sheer complexity of Compact law made arrogance difficult to sustain. Toward something more like clarity. Dr. Yael Ostroff, in a public lecture at the Geneva Institute for Strategic Studies delivered 14 months after the engagement, Put it this way. We have spent a great deal of our history wondering whether we are alone. We know now that we are not. We have spent a great deal of our history arguing about what kind of civilization we want to be. That question has not become easier. In some ways it has become considerably harder. But the universe has given us something that historical generations rarely receive. A very specific, very concrete test case for what our answer to that question actually is. We did not ask for the test. We passed it at cost. What matters now is whether we understand what the test was actually measuring. The test, she argued, was not military capability. It was institutional coherence, the ability of a fractious, argumentative, deeply divided species to make and sustain, over decades, a complex strategic decision that required trust in institutions that most people did not know existed. That, she suggested, was the thing that had surprised the galaxy. Not the ships. Not the weapons. The discipline. The diplomatic mission to the Compact's nearest recognized contact point took 4 years to prepare and 9 months to transit. It departed Sol System in 2074, 17 years after the engagement, aboard a vessel called the USDF Dialogue, a name chosen by the Security Council after a public competition that generated 11 million entries. The mission carried 43 diplomats, 29 translators, 16 legal specialists in Compact Protocol, 12 scientists, 9 military observers, and a crew of 204. Total complement, 314 people representing an institution, the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, that had been created specifically for this moment and did not exist before it. The Dialogue was not a warship. It was not unarmed. No vessel Earth sent into deep space would be after 2057, but its weapons were minimal, its design emphasized communication systems over combat capacity, and it was visibly, deliberately different from the Black Armada's aesthetic of shadow and silence. It was painted white in what was understood within the diplomatic community as a deliberate and somewhat self-aware choice. White shows up clearly on sensors. White is visible. White is the opposite of what Earth did in the outer system. We see you. Here we are. The head of mission was Ambassador Kwame Asante, a Ghanaian-born career diplomat who had spent 30 years in Earth's own international system before the Seoul incident and the subsequent decade working on the Compact Protocol briefings. He was 63 years old at departure. He was expected to be 75 before significant results could reasonably be anticipated from the mission. He accepted the appointment without hesitation. In his first transmission back to Earth, sent from beyond the heliopause and received with an 18-hour delay, he wrote, "We are moving toward something that no human being has ever moved toward before. I find this clarifying rather than frightening. I hope that is the right response." The Compact's reception of the dialogue was formally correct, which in Compact diplomatic language meant neither warm nor hostile, but governed by protocol and process. The mission was assigned a contact liaison from the Compact's External Relations Division, given temporary observer status at a Compact assembly session, and housed in a facility that the Compact had apparently constructed specifically for the occasion, suggesting that the mission's arrival had been anticipated with enough specificity to warrant preparation. The legal proceedings regarding the hegemony Sol System claim continued in parallel. The Compact's judicial processes were slow by human standards. A hearing that would take weeks in Earth systems could take years in the Compact's framework, primarily because the civilizations involved had different temporal experiences and the Compact had long since adopted a consensus-based timeline that accommodated the slowest participants. Earth's legal team, working with the Tesseract Collective's shared records as a precedent base, filed a comprehensive brief asserting Sol System's sovereign rights under the Compact's established developmental threshold criteria. The filing was 847 pages in its English version. The translation team produced versions in 41 Compact languages. It was, by any measure, a serious piece of legal work, the kind that doesn't get produced by a civilization that stumbled into a crisis unprepared. The hegemony challenged it as expected. The proceedings were expected to take years. On Earth, the years of the dialogue's transit and the early diplomatic exchanges produced a conversation that was, in some ways, harder than the engagement had been. The engagement had been, in its terrible simplicity, a problem with a physical answer. The diplomatic future was not simple and had no physical answer. The debate that consumed significant public and political energy was not about whether to engage with the Compact. That was settled by the fact of engagement. The debate was about what humanity wanted from that engagement. What kind of relationship, over what kind of timeline, on what kind of terms. The hawkish position argued for minimal engagement, maximal independence, continued development of the Armada, and a posture of armed neutrality that would make Earth simultaneously too costly to attack and too independent to co-opt. The logic was coherent. The compact was an existing institution with existing power structures and existing members who had vested interests in those structures. Joining on the compact's terms meant accepting those structures, at least initially. The internationalist position argued the opposite, that isolation in an interstellar community was ultimately unsustainable, that the information and technology available through compact membership would accelerate humanity's development far beyond what could be achieved independently, and that the compact's own legal framework, whatever its current limitations, provided a foundation for advocacy and reform that armed neutrality could not. The position that eventually commanded the most durable political support was neither. It was something that the diplomatic team in their internal communications began calling the Vorath model, referencing the historical case that had so struck analysts in the aftermath of the engagement. The Vorath had joined the compact. Not immediately. Not on the compact's initial terms. They had negotiated for decades from a position of demonstrated capability, and had entered the compact as founding permanent members with a specific, legally protected status that preserved their system's sovereignty and gave them veto authority over any expansion decisions that affected their region of space. It had taken them 130 years to achieve that status from the moment of their contested first contact. Humanity as a species tends to be impatient. The political challenge of the decades following first contact was, in many ways, the challenge of institutional patience. The same quality that had allowed the Armada to be built and maintained over 19 years, applied now to a diplomatic project whose timeline was measured in generations. Admiral Chen Wei retired from active command in 2069, at the age of 71, after 32 years in the outer system. Her retirement ceremony was the first Black Armada event held publicly, broadcast on every major network, attended by representatives of 87 nations. She received the highest military honor the United Earth government could confer and delivered a speech that was, by the standards of retirement speeches, unusually direct. The engagement was the easy part, she said. Anyone with enough determination and enough preparation can fight. What we are doing now, the talking, the negotiating, the long slow work of building relationships with beings who are profoundly different from us and operating within systems that are not designed with us in mind, that is harder. It requires the same discipline. It requires the same willingness to take damage without flinching. But the damage is different, and the victories are less visible. She paused. I have spent my career in the dark, in the cold, waiting. I am glad we had the ships. I am gladder still that we had the sense to use them only when necessary. The universe is watching to see what kind of civilization we choose to be. I am confident we will choose well. I am less confident we will choose quickly. But I have spent long enough in the outer system to know that patience is not the same as passivity. The dialogue reached its destination in 2075. Ambassador Asante's first in-person meeting with a compact liaison officer lasted 6 hours, covered 17 points of formal diplomatic protocol, and ended with something that the ambassador, in his transmission back to Earth, described simply as a genuine conversation. It was, by any historical measure, a beginning. Not the ending that stories usually seek, not the triumphant resolution, the signed treaty, the moment when everything clicks into place and the music swells. First contact, it turns out, is not an event. It is a condition. Something that begins and continues, that requires maintenance and adaptation and the constant exercise of judgment across a range of situations that no one has encountered before. Humanity had done what it needed to do in the engagement. It had demonstrated that it could not be coerced cheaply. That demonstration had purchased time. Time for diplomacy, time for legal proceedings, time to understand the shape of the institution they were dealing with and decide, carefully, where within it they wanted to stand. Whether that time would be used wisely was, as it always is, an open question. The galaxy had learned something about humanity in 2057. What it would learn in the decades and centuries following, what kind of civilization Earth would choose to be when given the chance to choose, rather than the necessity to react. That story was still being written. It is still being written now. And the people writing it are the same ones who built the ships in the dark, waited in the cold and chose, when the moment came, not to kneel,